What if I told you that one queen quietly reshaped Europe, not with armies or swords, but with poetry, whispered conversations, and the flicker of candles on parchment? Tonight, as you settle down to rest, we'll wander through Eleanor of Aquitaine's court, where knights debated love as seriously as they planned wars, and a simple verse could decide an alliance. This is not the story of battles or crowns. It's the story of how soft words in low-lit chambers carried enough weight to shift kingdoms. Curious? Let's dim the torchlight and step inside Poitiers. Hello, dear listener. Welcome to your journey to sleep on the Cozy Nights channel. Before we get started, feel free to like and subscribe. Imagine a court where the loudest clashes weren't the sounds of swords striking shields, but of voices carrying across a hall, debating poetry under the glow of candles. That was Poitiers in Eleanor's time. Picture long wooden tables scattered with parchment, the wax pooling at the base of narrow candles, shadows shifting over carved stone walls. Here, instead of drilling soldiers, nobles rehearsed verses. Instead of weighing armor, they weighed words. You can almost hear the low hum of murmured conversation, followed by bursts of laughter when a clever rhyme struck home. You'd expect a queen's court to sound like a war room, strategies slapped down with hard certainty, but Eleanor's hall was closer to a literary salon. Gentle fingers turned pages instead of sharpening blades. Troubadours, those wandering poets who carried their music across the countryside, found steady welcome here. Their songs, shaped around longing, honor, and sometimes carefully veiled politics, traveled farther than any rider on horseback could. Every note strummed on a lute was a message. Every verse whispered against the firelight carried a weight only those who listened carefully could decode. Legislation, other courts of the time might have scoffed at this quiet focus on song and story. Power was supposed to come through castles, coin, and cavalry. Yet Poitiers ran on something subtler. In the flicker of candles, nobles competed in wordplay with the same intensity soldiers showed on tournament fields. Some debates ended with mock judgments, as if love were a case to be argued before a jury of peers. These debates didn't stay tucked politely within parchment. Reputations rose or collapsed, depending on who was praised, who was outwitted, and who managed to charm the queens and ladies who guided these discussions. This practice even earned a name, the Court of Love. Imagine a gathering where alliances could form, not over banners waved in smoke-filled meadows, but over discussions of what it meant to behave with loyalty or grace. A knight who excelled in these debates could leave more admired than one returning from battle bloodied but silent. And admiration worked like currency. It bought loyalty, it built networks, it opened doors into the inner circle of influence. Just picture the polished floors beneath velvet shoes, the rustle of gowns as people shifted in their seats, the occasional cough echoing through massive stone chambers. All of it beneath the quiet judgment of Eleanor herself. Most rulers of the time wouldn't have given such talk a second thought, but Eleanor recognized something important. Ideas are as sharp as steel when they're released at the right moment. Poetry coaxed ears to listen. Conversation softened barriers. A knight who learned how to argue tenderly about love in verse could be shaped into a loyal ally, just as surely as one could be shaped on the battlefield. The difference was subtle. Blood dried, but words lingered. They echoed in the hall even after the tapers burned down to stubs. They retold themselves in court after court, where nobles repeated those same clever turns of phrase carried back from Poitiers. There's something almost unsettling in the contrast. Across the Channel, and in courts to the east, kings fumed and thundered about lost land or schemed on campaign. Poitiers, meanwhile, hummed with conversation, a simmering current of influence running quieter, but no less strong. And what at first seemed like mere entertainment, songs about longing, judgments on love, polished performances, slowly became a system that trained courtiers to think differently about power, loyalty, and behavior. It wasn't a field of battle, but a rehearsal for political survival. Here, failing a verse might be remembered as harshly as failing a skirmish. And so, poetry itself became strategy. The notes strummed across strings, the whispered lines carried through candle smoke, all of it wove into something larger than amusement. Eleanor wasn't simply enjoying music in her spare time. She was molding a culture that could serve her purposes, building a space where her authorities stretched in directions her male contemporaries never anticipated. At Poitiers, the quiet hum of verse could steady or unsettle entire relationships, just as surely as any army marching under banners. You might think of it as her own kind of battlefield, constructed with parchment and firelight instead of lances and shields. And soon enough, these very words, the playful songs and dialogues, would become more than entertainment. They would become tools Eleanor used to carve out her place in European politics, disguising influence beneath the soft rhythm of rhyme. What if love songs could redraw borders? It may sound far-fetched, but in Eleanor's world, verses carried more than sighs and sonnets. They carried stakes. Courtly love, at first glance, looked like harmless fun. Poets strummed lutes, knights recited lines about unattainable ladies, and courtiers leaned on tapestries to snicker at the latest performance. Yet under Eleanor's guidance, this pastime turned into something subtler, sharper. Poetry became politics. It was an arena where clever phrasing could outweigh armor, and where devotion, half feigned, half real, cemented loyalties that mattered far beyond candlelight debates. Think for a moment about the expectations of the time. Nobility was supposed to prove itself on the battlefield or at the tournament ground. Honor was measured through wounds, scars, horses, and banners. A knight's worth lay in how many charges he survived, how many enemies he bested. Yet, in Poitiers, worth could just as easily rise from a quill dipping gently into ink. A well-formed rhyme, convincing delivery, or subtle flattery could make an anonymous knight suddenly worth noticing. It was strange, even disconcerting. In a world seemingly built on brute force, the idea that lyrics about longing could build careers must have rattled traditionalists. Still, Eleanor saw its utility. Words softened people enough to bind them, and once bound, they could be mobilized in whichever direction suited her court. You might picture the hall here. Thick stone walls absorbing faint music, occasional coughs echoing under the high rafters, and lute strings trembling beneath the fingers of a troubadour perched near a fire. His words at surface describe a lady's beauty or the ache of distance. Yet each chorus whispered coded meaning, hints about loyalty, honor, or betrayal, carefully wrapped in allegory. Those listening knew that these messages mattered. A knight winning Eleanor's praise for poetic grace would find himself favored, granted trust beyond his birthright. In these moments, entertainment slipped quietly into statecraft. It is not unlike our own world, actually. Think of how carefully phrases are chosen in modern politics. The story told matters as much as the substance beneath it. A slogan, a polished headline, a photo staged in the right light. Those pieces of soft power sway hearts and restructure allegiances. Eleanor's use of poetry worked much the same way. Today, you might see a politician building influence through clever social media posts or interviews. In her time, the platform was a crowded hall scented faintly of melting wax and rushes laid fresh on the stone floor. Yet the outcome was remarkably similar. Soft words dictated hard results. The tension lay in appearances. Outsiders saw poetry contests as diversions, games to amuse households on restless evenings. What they missed was the competition beneath, the way Eleanor herself leaned in. When she smiled at a verse or offered a correction, she signaled more than approval. She was branding reputations. Favor in poetry meant traction in politics. Those who received it often found themselves secured to her orbit, a constellation of loyal supporters who owed their prominence not to their swords but to their syllables. That dependency could last years, weaving thick ties between lord, artist, and queen. Sensory details make this more vivid. Imagine the verses traveling across the hall, bouncing along with the crackle of torches, The smell of damp stone rises, mixing with herbs burned in simple bronze bowls to cover the musk of the room. Nobles whisper between performances, placing wagers under their cloaks about who will win Eleanor's nod. A knight, his armor left aside for the evening, kneels over parchment by torchlight, scratching last-minute corrections into his lines. The court is alive, not in bloodsport but in song. Every note, every line shifts reputations just enough to matter in tomorrow's plans. It is fascinating to think that when her guests composed innocent verses of love, what they built in reality were structures of obligation. A successfully performed song did not simply flatter a lady. It anchored a knight within layers of expectation. Reputation now depended on how closely he embodied the ideals sung about that night. To deviate from loyalty afterward would unravel both his honor and his verse. Poetry constrained people, bound them to subtle contracts never signed yet always felt. Perhaps that was its greatest utility. Control shaped not through war, but through shared ideals disguised as entertainment. You may wonder how much power words could truly carry. Yet history shows us that in her court, influence did not move only through armored marches. It seeped through whispered sonnets in the firelight, riding eventually into the strategies her sons would inherit. Poetry didn't just entertain, it reinforced hierarchies, drew networks tighter, and reminded every listener that loyalty was not just expected on the battlefield, but in every stanza too. The songs wrapped iron chains in silk ribbon. Perhaps no one noticed fully at the time, but Eleanor must have. And so, love songs redrew borders. Not in a single night, not through a single performance, but through the accumulation of reputation. Eleanor used them as scaffolding. Across years, verse structured authority as solidly as stone walls. It is one thing to win battles. It is another to craft minds until they believe those battles reflect eternal ideals. Through courtly love, she found her method. And this was only a step, for her influence stretched far beyond poetic games. Next, we'll see how she carried those same strategies into marriage alliances, shaping not just her circle at Poitiers, but the map of Europe itself. How does a queen dismissed in one court become the most powerful woman of her age? Eleanor of Aquitaine's life reads at first like a story of failure. Imagine her early days as Queen of France. Young yet already cultured, expecting her keen mind and rich inheritance to translate into political influence. Instead, she found herself married to Louis VII, a king whose piety and caution clashed with her sharp ambition. He prayed, planned, and hesitated. She laughed, argued, and wanted more. Their union carried heavy titles but remarkably little joy. She was silenced in councils, ignored in strategy, and turned into something ornamental. An extraordinary woman carefully disregarded. To someone like Eleanor, that frustration must have burned like hot wax dripping on skin. Irritating, constant, always reminding her that she was present but constrained. For a queen of her resources, that dismissal cut deeply. Here she was, heir to Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest regions of Europe, a land filled with vineyards, fortified towns, and a culture with its own pride. Yet, inside the French court, she was treated almost as if these gifts were less valuable than a prayer whispered in holy routine. Eleanor had grown up surrounded by song, poetry, political maneuvering layered into entertainment. Paris, with its rigid structures, offered fewer outlets for that energy. The court there was orderly but suffocating, measured in ritual and restrained conversation. A mismatch had taken root, and soon enough, everyone noticed. Even outside, whispers began to grow. Why was such an heiress left sitting quietly? It was a marriage that hollowed itself from within, and eventually, it fractured completely. When Louis set aside Eleanor in divorce, it looked like her undoing. Divorce in the 12th century was not only rare, it was humiliating. A queen set aside could easily vanish into obscurity, tucked in a convent or reduced to survival on diminished means. Many women of the time, stripped of male support, had little choice but to retreat. For Eleanor, however, divorce became the opening of a locked door. What appeared like a public rejection provided freedom. She was one of the few women wealthy and powerful enough to walk away, not diminished but newly available, and still immensely desirable as a political partner. Where others saw scandal, Eleanor saw possibility. Her second marriage redefined the political map of Europe. Within weeks of leaving Paris, she wed Henry, Duke of Normandy, a man more energetic and ambitious than her first husband could ever have been. Soon Henry would be crowned King of England, and suddenly Eleanor's reach stretched across an empire that sprawled from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. France had dismissed her, but now she straddled the English Channel with power anchored on both sides. Think of the scale of this transformation. One day she is a sidelined queen in Paris. The next she is mistress of territories so vast they made the Capetian holdings look small in comparison. Divorce, which threatened extinction for most, turned into a launch pad. You can imagine her on the move now, riding from Poitiers through rolling hills, then boarding ships to cross grey waters toward England. Behind her, wagons creaked under the weight of chests, tapestries, manuscripts and treasures from Aquitaine. Carved wood, painted cloth and fine embroidery followed her on those journeys, bringing the culture of her homeland into new courts. At Windsor or Winchester, servants would unpack trunks filled with cloth brighter and heavier than anything woven locally. The smell of southern herbs, dried and pressed into satchels during travel, would drift through stone halls, otherwise filled with the scent of smoke and meat. Wherever Eleanor walked, she carried with her the richness of Aquitaine, weaving it effortlessly into the English world she had newly acquired. The difference between rejection and triumph is striking. Where one king saw her strong presence as an obstacle, another saw it as an advantage. Henry II, ambitious and always pressing outward, welcomed the sharpness of her mind, though not always without friction. For Eleanor, the marriage offered something crucial, scope. Instead of narrow halls of Paris where her role was stifled, she now moved across Europe with authority, her lands linking France and England like a living bridge. Few women of her century wielded such expansive influence. Few men did, for that matter. And yet, it was all contingent on something most would have considered devastating, being publicly cast aside. Is that this shift placed Eleanor in uncharted waters. Many women would have disappeared after such a scandal, yet she somehow grew stronger. Every mile of territory, each castle and court she stepped through, became a part of her orbit. She re-emerged not only as a consort, but as a political architect. Border disputes, treaties, cultural ties, all of these could pass through her hands. What had looked like the end of her story turned out to be the moment it truly began. Still, there is a question lingering under all of this. As a queen without direct command of armies, how would Eleanor turn these vast resources into actual power? Kings measured their legitimacy through battles fought and won. Eleanor needed other tools to carve out her place. It wasn't enough to sit at Henry's side. She had to weave connections and strategies that didn't rely on leading troops into war herself. That challenge became her defining strength. She harnessed marriage not as submission, but as an instrument, a method to build a cross-cultural empire that reached wider than any single battlefield ever could. And yet, her most powerful tools were not yet fully visible. They existed not only in the realms of marriage contracts and inherited lands, but in the quieter spaces most courtiers overlooked. Behind stone walls, in candlelit conversations and whispered exchanges, Eleanor would shape the minds of generals, kings, and sons. These were the subtle laboratories of her authority, where strategies were spoken softly rather than announced. And it is here, in those quiet chambers, that the next chapter of her influence truly begins. Some of the most important decisions of medieval Europe may have been whispered in stone corridors. When we picture councils of kings, we tend to imagine crowded chambers filled with lords, clerks scratching at parchment and endless shouting over maps. Yet the truly powerful movements sometimes happened away from the official noise. Eleanor of Aquitaine mastered this quieter arena. In the shadows of torchlight, she exchanged whispers with husbands, sons, and confidants, reshaping the course of kingdoms without a sword ever being lifted. Think of it less like a pageant of state and more like a late-night conversation when the hall is half asleep and the slightest word still manages to echo. These private discussions carried a weight that official gatherings rarely reached. A council of war might announce a decision, but the spark that led to it could have been chosen hours before. Seated on a cushioned bench beneath tapestries of hunting scenes, Eleanor understood that advice spoken quietly often left the deepest impression. A question posed softly in private could sit in the listener's mind, lingering with them long after the official proclamations had faded. There is something disarming about a candlelit exchange when the crowd is gone, when one voice leans close, and when decisions feel more personal than political. That intimacy was dangerous, but it was also her advantage. Picture the setting. Heavy curtains muffle the sound of the outer hall. The thick tapestries hanging against the stone not only served as decoration, but also softened voices, ensuring that words stayed confined within safe walls. You hear the static crackle of torches burning low, the faint hiss as sap bursts in the wood. From time to time, a quick ripple of laughter drifts out. Not the kind of carefree mirth from feasts, but laughter carrying weight, layered with intent. The air holds a mix of smells. Smoke, tinged with the sweetness of beeswax candles, mingled with the faint odor of damp stone that never truly leaves medieval castles. This was the environment where Eleanor worked best. She could turn such surroundings, meant to be neutral, into stages where the future of kingdoms quietly shifted. Apollon-like parade-like councils, where speeches were recorded and protocols guarded every movement. Private discussions were treacherous. Risk sat in every word. Too much candor could be overheard. Too little persuasion, and the listener might dismiss it as idle talk. Yet success carried incredible reward. A king emerging from such a conversation often believed the next action was his own idea. Advice given in official council could be debated or challenged. Whispers in corridors had no opponents, just the one listener absorbing them. Subtlety gave her leverage where open argument would fail. Few people resist their own conclusions, and Eleanor ensured the conclusions her family carried out were often seeded by her voice in the dark. She used this method repeatedly. With Henry, she might choose moments when he was weighed down after a day of disputes, when defenses were lowered. With her sons, whispers often took the form of counsel laced with stories, encouraging them to see themselves as part of a larger design. She didn't force, she guided. Even in moments of tension, her advice crept into their strategies. A line about loyalty, a comment about reputation, a reminder of Aquitaine's legacy. These strands were stitched into grander patterns of war, diplomacy, and ambition. Her presence may not appear in official scrolls, yet its signature was felt in action after action. It calls to mind something familiar today. Think about how decisions in politics or business rarely come down to the speeches you see on television or the press releases you read. So much more happens behind closed doors. Private meetings, back corridors, late-night calls where language is cautious but loaded. Modern lobbying, in many ways, echoes this ancient pattern. The arguments whispered in private often guide outcomes far more than what is publicly announced. Eleanor was practicing that same craft in a time when the idea of female influence was often dismissed. She made influence stealthy precisely because it was denied to her in formal assemblies. And those whispers left a mark. Consider the impact stretched across generations. Sons shaped by her counsel carried traces of her thought into their own reigns. Wars in Europe, truces secured across borders. Even the handling of revolts resonated with guidance she once offered in passages no wider than a horse's stride. This is not to say that every move was hers. or that she was a shadow master pulling strings at all hours. Instead, her counsel moved like water through cracks unseen but persistent, carving out invisible channels that pointed events downstream. Control expressed without command, guidance without proclamation, and the legacy survived beyond the moment. Many turning points in English and French history trace their origins back to choices marked by her hand, not in ink across charters perhaps, but in the seed of a plan formed after a conversation by torchlight. Kings acted, lords petitioned, but Eleanor's words sat in the background, quietly guiding. The proof lies not in one note or decree, but in the pattern, without armies at her back, without a formal seat of command. She inserted herself into outcomes by the power of private counsel. Her whispers travelled farther and lasted longer than any public edict. Yet such a path was never stable. Secrecy brought as many dangers as rewards. If you live through whispers, what happens when you are silenced? Eleanor would eventually face imprisonment, hemmed in by walls stronger than any curtain, kept from her court and her allies. Even so, her voice did not vanish. Candles burned on, and letters carried her words beyond the bars. The story of how she maintained authority even then is its own testament to her resilience, and to the fact that silence was never truly possible for a queen who had learned to make whispers move empires. Can a ruler shape history without commanding battles? In Eleanor's world, the answer was yes. Her sons rode at the head of armies, banners rising with dust, armor glinting in the sun. She, on the other hand, stayed mostly in the background, without sword or armor. But that didn't mean she lived quietly. Her weapon was something different: persistence, influence. Words that traveled far longer than a knight's charge across a field. If you stop and think about it, battles end in a day, a split, a clash, a retreat. But influence, patiently applied, can last decades. That was Eleanor's gift, and it defined her rule more than any number of soldiers. Listings it's useful here to remember the expectations. Men of her world were measured with brutal simplicity. You won land, you were strong. You lost land, you were weak. But Eleanor sidestepped that test entirely. She was rarely seen leading armies herself, yet she still managed to occupy a central position in a Europe obsessed with military might. She discovered other channels through which to guide action: paper, messengers, and the steady persistence of letter after letter. Even when she was cut off physically, locked away by her husband for siding against him during his son's rebellion, Eleanor kept her voice alive through correspondence. Coded letters slipped from her confinement, delivered into hands she trusted. Each fold of parchment crossing the land was like a silent envoy, doing the work of armies, but without bloodshed. Now, picture that. A queen in captivity. She is older now, but still sharp-eyed, with hair streaked in silver and patience running deep. Imagine her seated with a single candle stub guttering in the dark, dictating words to a loyal clerk who scratched with his quill at parchment. Shadows stretch long across the walls, the smell of tallow thick in the air, and outside there is only the faint drip of water against stone. Her enemies may have thought they silenced her, but her ink travelled where her body could not. Riders delivered her messages, and men reading her words still adjusted their choices accordingly. Even behind locked doors, she continued to govern through endurance, not violence. When Richard embarked on his crusade, Eleanor's resilience became even more visible. The king was gone, the realm heavy with risk, yet it fell to her to hold things steady at home. Acting as regent in his absence, she took the wheel of government. That meant hearing petitions, managing revenue, ensuring that life carried on without descent into chaos, all roles traditionally assumed by men with military strength at their back. Yet there she was, late into her life, bearing the weight of administration. Think of the contrast. While her son sailed on distant seas, his mother, past the age most women of her time were tucked safely into retirement, was overseeing the entire kingdom with steady competence. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't sung about by troubadours, but it was critical. England did not collapse in his absence, and for that, the realm owed her as much as to any commander. What makes this remarkable is the way leadership here took form. It wasn't the glory-soaked imagery of banners and horses. It was quieter, folds of parchment stacked on a desk, reports carried in by tired messengers, strategies laid out with ink instead of steel. Think of Eleanor, dictating again in her calm but determined voice. Words covering paper, faster than riders could gallop across muddy roads. In a sense, her letters stretched farther than soldiers on horseback. Armies could only be in one place at one time. Words, once copied and carried, could sow order across an entire territory at once. That kind of reach isn't flashy, but it is profound. You might argue, what is leadership without the ability to command? But look closer, and it becomes clear that Eleanor was redefining what queenship could be. She proved it was possible to exercise sovereignty as a matter of intellect, persistence, and personal networks, rather than through battlefield triumphs. She absorbed defeats and imprisonment, but kept redirecting events through endurance. Queenship in her hands was not ornamental, it was active, firm, and deeply strategic. The fact she did so while surviving public scandal, rebellion, and exile makes her unusual even among extraordinary rulers. Consider how this fits into the rhythm of her whole life. Dismissed in France, she rebuilt herself in England. Imprisoned in one phase, she influenced the next from captivity. In older age, when most royal women faded from view, she governed entire realms. Her life demonstrates that sovereignty did not require physical violence. Leadership itself could be grounded in steadiness and a refusal to vanish from relevance. That resilience, always present, always patient, was more disruptive to her rivals than any sword unsheathed. And here is where the legacy stretches beyond politics. What she modeled was a different way of being powerful in a time that prized warfare. Not only did she shape political outcomes, her persistence etched itself into cultural memory as well. Generations imagined her not simply as Henry's queen or Richard's mother, but as a figure who endured through shifting tides, who left marks not in victories recited after battles, but in the continuation of order and culture, even during instability. It is that form of survival that allows her to stand out centuries later. If you close your eyes, you can almost picture the echo of her work. Not the clang of steel, but the dry scrape of a quill. Not a shout on the battlefield, but the soft command of a matriarch ensuring that the realm stayed balanced. This is why Eleanor remains compelling. She proved that sovereignty rests not only in immediate force, but in the ability to outlast and outthink. However heavy her surroundings became, she found routes of escape through endurance. Kingdoms fractured around her, but she remained central, her power as much in patience as in any soldier's loyalty. In the end, Eleanor showed that sovereignty survives even without war. Leadership flourished for her, not through death counts, but through letters, counsel, persistence, and quiet authority. That in itself is a more enduring kind of strength, one etched into the memory of what women could do, one that outlasted her armies and even her kings. And her influence didn't vanish with her final years. Ideas she nurtured rippled on, echoing through the generations that followed, shaping concepts of queenship, culture, and power. From here, we can begin to see how her legacy wasn't only political but cultural as well, her ideas seeding themselves into stories and traditions that still whisper across time. What remains when battles are forgotten? Words. The clash of armor fades, the banners rot, even the castles crumble down to moss-covered ruins. But stories, songs, the strange inventions of the human voice, those hold on far longer. If you've ever noticed how a phrase in a song lingers with you long after the music stops, you'll understand the strange kind of endurance Eleanor of Aquitaine nurtured. Her armies did not shake the foundation of Europe in the way her culture did. The soldiers of her time have names few people remember. But the words she coaxed into life stretch centuries, echoing in cathedrals, universities, and manuscripts that never once bore her direct signature, but nonetheless carried her mark. Armies fade in two ways. Sometimes they vanish quickly, in defeat, like smoke blown out by rain. Sometimes they dissolve slowly, as veterans leave battlefields for farms, taking with them fading memories of commanders. Either way, they are fragile. Ideas, though, plant themselves differently. They attach to memory, slip into play, spread quietly from one voice to another. Poets came to her court in Poitiers, inspired primarily by patronage, by promise of security, by the thrill of performing before noble eyes. What they left behind, however, was not bound by place or time. Troubadour traditions, songs of love and loyalty stitched together in verse, outlasted every fortress she walked through. And eventually, centuries later, a poet in Florence named Dante would pick up shades of those ideas and bend them into one of Europe's foundational works. That root, faint though it was, reached back to Eleanor's circles, where courtly expression had been tended with more care than many rulers gave to diplomacy. So imagine the contrast. Knights sweating under metal plates, bleeding out onto hard ground. Their victories, if won, offered only temporary control. Now imagine a handful of verses, shared in a candlelit corridor. They are copied, sung, repeated at other courts, their lines adjusted in transmission but recognizable in feel. They find their way into manuscripts. They influence not policy immediately, but the way aristocrats learn to think about duty, about affection, about loyalty. The staggering truth is that this kind of endurance shaped more of what the medieval world became than countless battles. Politics stand on fear. Culture endures on memory. Take the ethos of courtly love, a phrase that makes most people think of Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, all knights kneeling to ladies. But in Eleanor's shaping, it was less a playful fancy and more a form of instruction about behavior. Knights were meant to discipline their roughness, to renounce their raw appetites, to present themselves as men capable of balance. Honor was no longer only violence performed under a banner. It became the capacity to restrain emotions, channel them into words, grant women symbolic influence in exchanges. Long after Eleanor had died, this same ethos hardened into the codes of chivalry we still talk about today. When textbooks describe expectations of knights, deference, loyalty, courtesy, they are describing a world rooted in court culture she reinforced. The way men came to act in battle, the way they spoke about community or service, cannot be separated from the entertainment she curated centuries before. So, let's bring the moment alive. A cold stone hall, perhaps far to the north. Long after her own court dissolved, the walls sweating condensation, the smell of straw covering the floor sharp in your nose. A minstrel, hired for the night, performs verses he only partly understands the origins of. His voice carries out into the rafters, echoing against emptiness. A noble audience nods along, because they already know similar versions. None of them imagine they are repeating scaffolding provided by a queen dead for generations. Yet they are. That's the quiet persistence of influence. Centuries later, an echo still resonates from moments lit once only by candles and filled with parchments scrawled in Aquitaine. The fact this survived is not surprising, and yet it is remarkable. War stories erase themselves. One battle is soon displaced by another, then another. But poems, lyrics, conditions of love, they instruct not only in the moment, but in what comes after. Eleanor's genius was not in penning them herself, but in turning her court into the cradle where they mattered. She nurtured the space where those stories developed an aura of importance. Her unseen strength was embedding words into culture itself. That foundation endured far better than any stone castle she could command or any temporary triumph her armies gained. Think about your own world. The wars of a century ago still interest historians, but what lasts in daily life are the words, the songs, the cultural habits passed down quietly. Music reflects identity. Stories provide continuity. The architecture of culture shapes more of our present than the architecture of conquest. Eleanor's quiet revolution becomes visible here. She proved that whispering verses into attentive audiences could transform the way Europe thought about duty and affection. That, more than her armies, became her monument. The concept of courtly love began as entertainment, but didn't remain there. It became the scaffolding for Europe's cultural map, influencing not only songs and poems, but the expectations between men and women, nobles and knights, even lords and their dependents. It shifted how honor itself was defined, how loyalty was measured, how ties were justified. Empires rose and fell in her lifetime. Every one of those empires eventually eroded back into dust and grass. Yet poetry's long shadows stretched, and even today, when someone speaks about medieval love, or when the idea of a noble knight is conjured in the public mind, that shadow still exists. So what remains when battles are forgotten? Not the scars on the soil, not the lines on maps erased a dozen times since. What remains are words. The whisper at Poitiers survives, more vividly than cries that rang at Crécy or Hastings. Eleanor's legacy slipped into stories and codes and traditions, and from there into the foundation stones of culture itself. And that permanence of soft influence, gentle, almost invisible, guides us into the final reflection of her life, that whispers can outlast cannons, and ideas can persist longer than thrones themselves. Eleanor's power was never really in swords or castles. It lived in the slow persistence of ideas she set loose, quiet, almost invisible, but lasting far longer than the reigns of men around her. That's the lesson worth taking with you. Whispers can move empires more than armies. And if you think about it, we still live in a world where culture outlives conflict. Songs, stories, and ideals linger, while battles blur. So as you settle into rest, let your mind drift with that thought, that the strongest revolutions often arrive softly, shaping tomorrow while the world sleeps.